There's been some talk out there that 2024 was a lackluster year for games. Now, I'm not one of the people that subscribes to that idea myself. I think the year was loaded with gems all over the place. We got fed pretty well in 24, but regardless of what I think, there's some people that look at the year we had, they see the failures that occurred, some of the AAAs that came out, and they say, the year was kind of underwhelming. There were some big flops, and if we look at the top end of the games, while there's a very competitive list of maybe 10 or so games that are in the combo for best game of the year, there was nothing that was like a solidified top 20 all-time great game from an initial glance. This is the criticism I've heard, right? But I've been doing some thinking. I've been sitting around analyzing the space and the trends, and I've come to a pretty bold conclusion. 2024 might be the most significant year in modern gaming that I can think of. It may be too early to say that, but there's some things that happened this year that, as a businessman myself, I recognize. And if I recognize them, I'm sure the big billion-dollar companies recognize them as well, seeing that they got whole teams whose job it is to analyze and scope out the market. Gaming has some issues that have plagued it for some time now, things that it feels like the consumer is almost unanimously in agreement needs some change. And this year, whether intentional or not, we saw pivots away from those issues that may affect gaming going forward in a positive way. Before we get there though, let's talk business. According to Statistica, the revenue brought in from gaming this year was around $455 billion. We're talking big money. Much more money than the roughly $30 billion it was doing in the year 2000. Gaming is worth way more today. And as an industry's numbers grow, the industry becomes more corporate. Everything explodes. Company sizes, R&D increases. You start managing more and more projects, all in the pursuit of the almighty dollar. And in that corporatization process, there's some passion lost, you know? That fire you had in the beginning to give people the best shit you could possibly conjure up, it fades a little bit. Instead, the mindset shifts more towards how can we keep people coming back with the least amount of effort? After all, more effort is more money spent, and we're trying to make money here. So how do we do enough to keep people engaged while not overdoing it and cutting into our profits? We used to live in a world where a game's quality was carried by either the story or how fun the gameplay was, or a combination of both. Everything else kind of took a back seat to that. They were just bonus points. If the game had great narrative work and gameplay made for a fun time, that was it. You had a banger on your hands. And that was relatively easy to fund. The average price of a AAA game back in the 2000s was in the millions. And for a AAA, that's light. You sell 1 million copies and you just 10x your money. AAA devs were thriving in this era because the idea was simple. We're already a big company. We got to come up with a good story, throw some state-of-the-art gameplay in there, and we got a free money glitch. And those games were simplistic enough that development didn't take 10 years. You could pump out good games, no problem. But as the years go on, the gaming industry continues to expand and innovate. Games got bigger, more money started getting invested into games. Those games that cost $5 million to make now cost $500 million. Those linear stories were replaced by massive open worlds filled with things to do. As companies got bigger, the games got bigger. The problem there is you need the sales of games to grow at the same rate that your investment is growing for it to make sense financially. And for a lot of these companies, that just didn't happen. But lucky for them, a new money machine entered the battlefield that looked like the future for corporate greed. The microtransaction boom of the 2010s changed gaming forever. Some would say for the worse, but I like to look at the glass half full on these things, and it would be disingenuous to act like microtransactions didn't allow for some incredible things. First off, having a way for people to optionally pay for things in-game opens the door for free-to-play games, which, yeah, there's a whole argument there about how free-to-play live service games can be scummy and everyone hates them, but there's also the other side of that coin where now anyone in the world has the ability to play games like Fortnite or Valorant or League without spending a dime. You can play the biggest titles in the world with your friends, and you don't need to pay for anything other than the console itself. Accessibility is only a positive for gaming. The problem is when that microtransaction feature becomes abused. See, at this point, free-to-play live service games have a really bad name for themselves. There's a lot of cases of this business model being treated as a money scheme instead of a passion for the art form. A way to just keep players around spending money on something that deep down they don't even really enjoy anymore, but they're psychologically stuck. They've invested hundreds of hours and dollars, so it would be stupid to quit now. And it makes sense to have these things in free-to-play multiplayer titles because you gotta fund your game somehow. So to tell your audience, hey, we'll give you a skin for supporting our free game, I don't think there's any harm in that. But then you get into practices of pay to win mechanics, paying to progress, battle passes that include exclusive seasonal items or gear, and it all becomes a little weird. It feels like you're just trying to find new ways to incentivize us giving you money. If you want people's bread, just say that. Charge $60 for your game like a normal person. Don't reel us in with the idea of your game being free to then tell people they gotta pay to get this cool weapon. And all of that brings us back to 2024. When we recap this year and look at the biggest moments, the best games, we see a lot of games that have one thing in common. Almost none of them had microtransactions. Sure, you've got your Call of Duties, Marvel Rivals just got here, but this was not a particularly popular year for live service stuff. We didn't see too many free-to-play titles pop up and make significant noise. Most of the ones that did settled down pretty quick. This year saw a lot of games with a price tag on it, and that was it. And I think it's because companies are coming to the realization developing live service games comes with way too much risk. I talked about this on TikTok a few months back, but a lot of these big names in the live service space aren't making the money we just assume they are. Overwatch 2 has been a roller coaster financially since it released. Destiny has had its hiccups on the money side. And if I'm a developer and I see that even some of the biggest names in that space are having a tough time, what makes me think me coming in with something brand new and unestablished is gonna be different? Live service games fall flat on their face more times than not, and game devs aren't in the business of gambling. They're in the business of making safe money like every other business is. And I really like to believe this year showed a pivot for that. Now, if you think I'm saying microtransactions are just going to disappear, you definitely got it twisted. Microtransactions are never going away. Riot is still going to charge you $100 for a skin with a smile on their face. Call of Duty is still going to make you pay for that random Bob's Burgers collab skin. But I mean, even if we look at Ubisoft, one of the kings of microtransactions, once there was a rumor that Assassin's Creed Shadows was going to have a battle pass, they were super quick to jump out there and make it clear to everyone that there will be no battle pass in the game. The climate around microtransactions is very gloomy, and it seems like devs are recognizing the microtransaction thing doesn't need to be overused. It was a cute little experiment there for like 5 to 10 years, but the people are clearly not the biggest fan of this business model being placed into every game they play, and so we're right back to paying for games. Even during the free-to-play craze, gamers have always been willing to pay for a game that they see as a worthy purchase. Indies have been doing nothing but getting better and better over the years, pushing the industry forward, gaining more momentum, while the titans were over there duking it out over who can sell the most skins. And that sort of leads me into the other big shift I think this year impacted. Just the overall quality of games, what it means to make a good game that people want to play. It's no secret, man. There's some AAAs that have lost some of their sauce in recent years. Going back to what I said earlier about how games got bigger and more expansive, in that process, the concept behind what makes a game great got lost in translation for some of these companies. A lot of them got caught up in trying to push the boundaries with graphics or how big they can make their worlds. Look at the water physics when you move around. That's all adorable, but that's not what's gonna make your game good. Remember what I said about how 2000 games were all about narrative and gameplay loops? Balatro didn't get nominated for Game of the Year because of its hyper-realistic graphics or diverse world options. People fell in love with that game because the gameplay loop was like a drug. Metaphor ReFantazio wowed people because of its masterful narrative work. Astrobot didn't need a $500 million budget to be the best game of the year. You can look at this year and say it wasn't top heavy with like some super insane all-time classics, but I think this year had an insane amount of games that just knew what it means to be a good game. And I wholeheartedly believe that revelation comes from the impact indies have had on the industry in the past few years. Indies and AA's have been screaming from the top of their lungs to let AA's know, look, this is how you make a good game. All that fancy development shit y'all do, it's cool and all, but we've got the formula for the stuff people enjoy. The formula that has worked since the beginning of time that y'all have just seemed to abandon. And the fact that we saw massive big budget failures this year like Concord or Skull and Bones, all those instances do is solidify the notion that going forward, if you're a AAA, you have to adjust the formula. If you want to stay on top, you have to get back to the thing that puts you on top, putting the enjoyment of your game before all that other shit. And recently, I think there were some showings of AAAs coming to that realization. This wasn't in 2024, this was last year, but I think Dave the Diver is a great example of what I'm saying. This game has the look and feel of an indie game. It's got an addictive gameplay loop. The game has a lot of character to it. Not hyper-focused on realistic graphics, but still has a very enjoyable art style. It was made by some random company nobody's ever heard of named Mint Rocket, right? And everybody loved this game. The game reviewed great, it sold great, and then you start to do some digging, and you find out that Mint Rocket is just a front for being Nexon, one of the biggest Korean devs out there. This game was made by a AAA, but it was branded as an indie, and it's one of the best games Nexon's ever dropped. Don't think for a second that wasn't crafted that way on purpose. Listen to this snippet. In 2022, Nexon announced the launch of Mint Rocket, a sub-brand division of Nexon that specializes on games focusing on the essence of fun. No shit. They develop a game with the sole purpose of being fun, and the result is being a game that does $1 million in sales in a week on a ramen noodle level budget. Go figure, man. If I'm a AAA dev, I'm looking at the positive reception this year of games like Balatro and Prince of Persia. I'm noticing how well received the remakes of 25-year-old games like Silent Hill 2 and Final Fantasy VII were. Games that don't necessarily fit into the modern day formula of a AAA game that still went over extremely well. And I would come to the conclusion that the times are changing. Spending $500 million on a huge open world isn't the selling point it was thought to be at one point. Your game isn't going to be the next Red Dead Redemption 2 because you filled the world with a bunch of interactable things. And these hiccups that devs like EA or Ubisoft have suffered through over the past few years, they've served as trial and error blueprints for not only them, but for the rest of the industry to be able to continue pushing forward and getting better. And as good as I think this year was in terms of output of games, I think it also served a purpose in helping to make future games even better. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe, or don't.